So my title's changed a little bit since I first started my abstract. I cut off the second half. So now it's a child's experience, a reflection on children in Quito, Ecuador. I really wanted to start with that because it is really my reflection. It's my own experience, it's my observation. So I'm not trying to give you all these facts or say that I did stuff that I actually didn't do. It's just my observations and how I saw my experience. So that's me. I'm Alex Spriov. Like Sylvia said, I'm a senior this year, health and society major and Spanish minor. Last spring I had the opportunity of studying abroad in Quito, Ecuador. And I was taking a class at the University of San Francisco de Quito, which was like about 20 minutes away from where I was living in Quito. Alongside with this, I was taking a course called Quito in Transition, which is through Beloit, but we were out in the community kind of having experiences that sort of give you experiential learning outside of a classroom setting. Along with this, I decided to do my final research paper on the children of Ecuador and sort of their rights and how I saw them. And I ended up volunteering in an orphanage for the last few weeks that I was in Ecuador. So the typical classic geography lesson slide. Here is a map of South America. On the west side of the map between Colombia and Peru, you can see Ecuador. It's the little blue one. And I don't know if you can really tell from this map, but in there is Quito. And Quito is the second most populated city in Ecuador, second to Guayaquil, and it's the capital. There are 1.6 million people just in Quito alone. So when I was looking around, there are people everywhere. You know, it's a very urban place. So as you can see from my pictures on your right, there are a lot of pictures of infrastructure and the buses. And I mean, it's a really beautiful city. There are malls. You know, I didn't expect to see malls, but there are malls. There was a Fridays. There was Chili's. So what my point is here is it's just a very urbanized place. And I just felt like I was surrounded by people all the time. As you can tell in the second picture, actually in the middle, that's houses that just go all the way up the mountain. So I was just in this mountain range, but it's like a city at the same time. So it was really, really cool experience. So with that being said, the demographics, this is kind of to show you a little bit how they break down compared to the US. So in gold, you can see that percentage of 18 and under in Ecuador is 41%, whereas in the US it's 23%. And I took this number because I was seeing kids everywhere. I was seeing them, you know, on the streets. I was seeing them with families. I was seeing them begging or selling or school, everything. And I really took this to heart because I was thinking, well, okay, why am I seeing so many kids? And that's why I decided to volunteer at an orphanage to kind of get a better understanding of, you know, the children in Quito. So I volunteered at an orphanage. Pictures of the orphanage that I volunteered at were on the right, and it's Hogar para sus Niños. And I was there for a few weeks, and it's an orphanage that's funded by a family from California. They're Christian-based organization, and it's a well-funded organization. They have kids there that are suffering from mental or physical disabilities oftentimes, and they really do a great job of taking care of these kids. So that was a really cool experience to be a part of, but I also had this other experience before I found this organization, and it was a different orphanage. And when I got there, on the left-hand side was this sort of run-down orphanage. There were a lot of kids and a lot of small spaces. But then on the right side, there was this chain link fence, and you could see through it, and it was this field of kids that were playing, and it was a private school. And so they were playing in their uniforms. And looking at this, I noticed the difference between not only orphanages in Ecuador, but I really wanted to know more about perhaps the disparities of children on the streets in Ecuador as well. So I kind of wondered, like, how did these children get to the orphanage? What are they doing there? And if there are orphanages and foster homes, why are there still so many kids on the street? So it was really the kids that I became increasingly aware of while I was in Quito. And it struck me that I work with kids a lot in the US. We don't see this in the US. We don't see kids on the street. We don't see kids working like I saw in Quito. So I began to observe, and one of the things that also really struck me is the way that other Ecuadorians would treat these kids on the streets. And, you know, for me, I was like, oh, where are these kids' parents? I got to find them, you know, collect them and, you know, give them all money and candy, whatever they need. But the other Ecuadorians were sort of just, you know, treating them like another daily routine. So, this is my initial experience with children in Quito. I found this excerpt in a book that I was reading that really solidified my experiences and kind of made me question a little bit my understandings of how I saw the kids in Ecuador. And this comes from a book called Begging as a Path to Progress, Indigenous Women and Children and the Struggle for Ecuador's Urban Spaces, but written by Kate Swanson. And the reason why I put this slide here is because I feel like it sets up a really good image of things that you would maybe normally see on the streets of Quito. It says, a young indigenous girl approximately 6 years old approaches a foreign tourist. She wears jogging pants under a naku skirt and a chumbi woven belt, a faded Walt Disney t-shirt and a blue chalina wrapped around her shoulders. Regálame, give me a gift, she says, while extending her open hand. At a busy intersection, a member of the Ecuadorian upper middle class encounters a young indigenous woman at his driver's side window while he idles at a stop sign in his SUV. Compre chicles, buy gum, the young woman says, with a few packets of gum lodged between her fingers. Catching the driver's eye, she gives a supplicating gesture and points to the toddler strapped to her back. Para el huevito, for the baby, she says. So I kind of wanted to unpack this a little bit and talk about the imagery in just this excerpt. So first of all, some of the words in italics are from an indigenous Ecuadorian language called Quechua. And you can see that this is sort of a juxtaposed image where they're describing chumbi woven belts and a chalina is like a shawl. And then it's also juxtaposed with this Western image of a Walt Disney t-shirt. Also, you can see the contrast between indigenous individuals on the street and then this image of an SUV at a stoplight. I mean, can you even imagine that? And I mean, I feel like it just really sets up the sort of the gap between, the poverty gap really between the rich and the poor. And it really made me reflect on what I was seeing every day when I was walking to the bus, every day when I was going to school. So what I didn't realize is that these images, or that image that I just set up for you, doesn't necessarily mean that these kids are always homeless, which is something that maybe I thought to begin with, like all these kids on the streets, I can't believe how many are homeless. But that's not necessarily always the case. So again, referring to Kate Swanson's research, she describes the differences. And this became really clear for me because she says children of the street and children in the street. So a child of the street, usually a child who does not have home. Children in the street usually are working during the day and return to their homes at night. This is actually a really important understanding because oftentimes these groups overlap, and sometimes the children that are in the street might end up sleeping in the street like the children of the street. And you know, what's important to understand is that these two groups may have very different lifestyles, and that's not something that I took into consideration while I was seeing them on a daily basis. So, children of the streets. Initially, my Quito and transition research led me to look at these kids because these are the children that legislation addresses when discussing abandonment and adoption policy. To my initial understanding, this is what I thought all the kids were on the streets of Ecuador. Well, okay, so what does this mean? So a typical child between the ages of 6 to 13. They're likely to have been abandoned, exploited, suffer mental or physical disabilities, or abuse. So this oftentimes leads to the government taking them in and putting them into an institution, an orphanage, a foster home. Often these kids are from indigenous backgrounds. From my speculation, they're supporting themselves by begging. They're not supporting other people. They don't have the means to make a profit. They're basically just supporting themselves, and they don't have anything to sell per se. You'll see why that's relevant in the next slide. And you see these kids perhaps more often in the same spaces. When I was walking to the bus often, I would see the same people over and over again that were in the streets. And also something to keep in mind is that these children are put on the streets due to poverty. This moves me into my why. So why do they end up like this? I don't exactly know all of the reasons why they end up like this, but some of them, referring to my research and sort of my speculation from the orphanage and from what I researched in Ecuador, is that parents are lacking the proper financial resources to support a child, or there are family problems or abuse or violence within the house, or potentially there's an unwanted pregnancy and the woman gives up her child. So, children in the streets. This is the other category of child that I encountered on a daily basis that I wasn't really aware of when I first came to Ecuador and saw all these kids in the streets. Now looking back, it makes a difference because of that overlap that I described to you a little bit earlier. And I really didn't actually make this connection until reading this book that Swanson wrote. So as you can see, 6 to 15, they're a little bit older. These are children that do in fact have homes, and oftentimes they're large families, that are living under one roof. They're more frequently found in public spaces, on the buses, on the streets, outside of international airports. I saw a lot of kids on the buses. These children, unlike the children of the streets, are potentially selling something. So I saw a lot of kids selling gum. I saw a lot of kids shoe shining. I saw a lot of kids selling flowers, or perhaps working in the markets. And it's important to remember, again, like the other group of kids, is that poverty is putting them in these positions. But this is also a means of profit for them. So a couple reasons, again, just to reflect on why these kids might be in the streets, is for these 3 reasons that I kind of researched and sort of observed. So the first one, a lot of these people are coming from rural areas, and they're coming to the city and dealing with this urban life. And they can't really sustain their life in agriculture anymore, so they come to the city, and it's this high demand of the urban city, and trying to make ends meet in the city. But they only really have few marketable skills because they've been working in agriculture, they've been working on their farms, and they find limited employment. So they find that begging and selling is this viable means of income. The second thing, a lot of the kids that are in the streets support their families. My host sister was explaining to me that a lot of times the parents actually send their kids out into the streets so that they can come back and have a profit for their families at the end of the night. A last thing to consider is that a lot of these kids really do want to go to school, and so they need funds to attend school. Even though in Ecuador education is free, it's not really free. There's things like uniforms, books, lunches that you have to consider. So I feel like children in the street are sort of facing this, as you can see from my pictures on your right, they're sort of facing this dual identity of being, a student and perhaps being a child in the street. So this is again a quote in the book that I read by Kate Swanson. She's talking to a priest, and this is her interviewing a priest, and he's talking about the kids in Ecuador that you see on the streets. He says, "He may begin selling candies, but he will end by selling cocaine." I thought this was a really powerful quote because it's kind of showing how many false representations and how many misrepresentations of children on the streets in Quito, how they really face that. So there's this assumption that our behaviors now lead to making us criminals later. And that's especially true for, at least from what I saw, especially true for indigenous populations. They fall into these stereotype roles, and they sort of succumb to the way that other people see them. So Kate mentions in her book that the ideas that she describes are constructed images of white mestizo, usually living in the city, sort of associated with modern and progressive ideas, whereas the indigenous people that are associated with rural and decay. So that leads to the children sort of having these stereotypes of dirty, lazy, or juvenile, or out of control. But more often than not, these kids are aware of their identities and they manipulate them so they can best, they can use their audience to their best profit. And they can, they're super strategic. They, why do we have to assume that these kids are juvenile when they have amazing, selling techniques? So that was something that I really considered, is because I was definitely a target a lot of times. So finally, what is being done? There are a lot of really great things that are being done to address this issue of the children on the street. But I think that there's a lot of deeper issues that need to be sort of looked at and talked about more. So the first one, the UN Convention of the Rights on Children. I sort of have a pros and cons list up there. In 1989, world leaders decided that children need special care and protection. So they joined, Ecuador is one of the 192 countries that joined this international convention. And so they decided that they were going to recognize and promote the rights of children, which is awesome. And in 1990, the Ecuador actually ratified the UN Convention. And because of this, the state now offers them preferred, prioritized, and special protection under the law. But it also says that children are these vulnerable group. Well, I was reading that a lot of the kids that do work in rural areas sort of have this idea of maturity and responsibility at a lot younger age. So are they really vulnerable, and are they really this dependent group? That's sort of something that I was wondering. And also, another thing that I kind of mentioned throughout my slides is that does this adequately address the problem of poverty? Which goes into the next box down, which is the code of the child and the adolescents, and then the Constitution. So this is another great thing because it's a specific legislation for the rights of children that protect them against circumstances like abandonment, abuse, and exploitation. The code provides the state with comprehensive protection to all the children in Ecuador, providing them with freedom, dignity, and fairness. And this is for all kids that are under the age of 18. And a lot of these were written into the Constitution, but again, it kind of falls into the cons of the ones above it too, where it's, does this adequately represent the idea of poverty? And does it fix the problem of poverty? Well, it doesn't. And finally, like I mentioned before, education is obviously really important, but this idea of free, right? Like I mentioned before, is it really free? It's not really free because kids need to pay for uniforms, kids need to pay for food, and kids need to pay for books. There's a 25% dropout rate after 5th grade in Ecuador. And even though Ecuadorian constitution requires all children to achieve a basic level of education, that's about 9 years. And where are these kids actually at after that education, especially if they're working and selling on the street? How much can they achieve while having this dual identity? I'm not making the case that this situation for the children of or on the in or of the streets is positive or ideal. I'm saying that there are a lot more complexities that I didn't really even understand when I went. So as far as notes to planners or policymakers or social workers, they should consider the complex and varied factors that push these marginalized families and children into begging and selling. Yeah.
Why do you think that the children are moving from the rural areas into the city? Wouldn't it make more sense to stay in the rural areas where they at least have like forests to provide like food at least for themselves?
The question was, why are these families moving to urban areas when they should have means to sustain themselves in rural areas? You know, that's something that I was kind of wondering too, but from what I read is that these families can't any longer sustain themselves with agriculture. So they need to find another means of income, but then they move to the cities and they can't sustain themselves there either. So which is why they're kind of like pushed into poverty. Yeah.
Is there local help provided by the town or something like a center for the children where they could come and I don't know, because like during the time they're on the street they won't eat and they won't, I mean they will be tired, especially when they're in school in the morning maybe and in the street in the afternoon. So are there like local organizations that would help them to, you know, at least have a more comfortable time, or is there only the things you put in your, you know, the government, the laws, protections and everything? Like are there local helping organizations?
That's a really good question. The question is, what are local organizations that are helping these children? And actually, every Tuesday night we go to trivia at this Irish pub, and it was super fun, but it was sponsored by an organization that does try to help these kids. And there are local things that are trying to help, but on a governmental level, I think it's a lot deeper, and there are a lot more things to try to understand. But that's also something I would love to get to know more about.
Not just because you said there are laws to protect the children, but apparently, I mean, they're still on the street, so.
Right, and that goes along with my legislation point. Just things to keep in mind is that I would like to know more about how legislation actually plays out. Thanks. Yeah?
You stayed with the host family, right?
Yeah, I stayed with the host family. That's the question.
How did they feel about, I guess, this issue? Did you talk to them about it?
Did I talk to my host family about this issue? Actually, recently I've been emailing back and forth with my host sister, and she works, she worked at an indoor ice rink, which gives you an idea of the malls, because it was in the mall. But she worked at an indoor ice rink, and now she works with kids, and she was telling me that to her, it's sad that she sees these kids that are working and then go out and go to school and then work and then go out and go to school. But you know, I never really did talk to my family about it while I was there. It just kind of became a part of daily life, which I think is also one of the problems that happens with this issue, is that it's overlooked often. Thanks. Yes.
So I think it's like a common thing to like kind of initially you study abroad or travel abroad and you see something and then and kind of make assumptions about it. But I guess you identified something and then wanted to like explore the complexities. And I guess I'm wondering what like how does someone do that? What are tools to question things, or like do you think that's an important thing to bring with you when you go abroad?
To rephrase that, basically what are important tools to unpack what I learned abroad or how I deal with these issues abroad. So one of the things that really helped me was I was gone for 123-ish days, and every single day I wrote. And looking back on what I wrote, you can kind of see the change of the things that I started to think were like, oh my gosh, this is really amazing. And then it kind of becomes part of daily life. So I think that writing was definitely really helpful for me. Little insert from my blog. If you want to check out my blog, talk to me. But I think that would probably be my way of doing it, and just really open your eyes to new opportunities and understanding the world around you a little bit more. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.